All right, YouTube, I was literally just asked a couple of minutes ago to do a video on peak oil. Now, I've been meaning to do a video that relates to that topic for some time, a number of months. So I figured I'd cover it now. Now, I've had a little bit of wine, so if I sort of stumble a bit here, you know why. I'm not drunk, but I'm just a little bit tipsy. My thoughts on peak oil are they don't even specifically know how oil is produced. We know where coal comes from. It's this old compacted plant matter that slowly over time you get peat moss, and then that compacts and compacts because it doesn't biodegrade easily, because it's so acidic. It sort of continues until it's basically just lumps of fossilized stuff. We know how that forms. As for oil, they used to think it was literally nothing more than liquid dinosaur. That is, that a bunch of dinosaurs long ago fell into a fucking tar pit or something. They rotted anaerobically, of course. They sort of got rendered down and stewed over time into a bunch of these, natural gas and oil, essentially. We now have good reason to believe that's not the case. Now, I will tell you my theory as to where oil comes from, and I'm sure some petrochemical engineer can come along and say, well, you're wrong because, or this is possible, or maybe likely, or whatever. I think what's happening, and I base this on the fact that old, dried up oil fields have become active again in certain regions of the world. I believe that archaebacteria, which if you took honors or advanced placement biology, you know what archaebacteria are, extremophile bacteria. Some of them live in the Earth's crust. Miles down, there's still life. I believe that they're responsible for the creation of oil. That is, that these bacteria are all over the place. They require certain things. You might be talking about an area where there's more running underground water or more stagnant underground water, less radiation, more radiation, whatever it happens to be, any of a number of factors within the crust. We would think of the actual, literally, the climate and the composition of areas of the crust. What's happening, I believe, is that these archaebacteria, these extremophile deep crust bacteria, they grab up nutrients. Some of them literally absorb radiation. Some of them are chemophiles, that is, that certain chemical compounds form the basis of their resources that they need to grow, to replicate, to survive. They excrete material over time, slowly. Nobody knows the rate at which oil is generated either, so I shouldn't say slowly. When this gets excreted, it forms deposits. These deposits get squeezed from areas of higher to lower pressure. That is, that a fissure, a pocket of material that's less dense, that's more porous, slowly over time gets filled in with the excretory deposits of archaebacteria where they are at high enough concentrations to do so. That is, that if you've got a big-ass oil field somewhere a mile into the crust or whatever, it's because the area around it is filled with bacterial life, for whatever reason. And it has formed a literal pool of compressed oil and gases and so forth. It's poop. It's bacteria poop. What happens is if you siphon it back out, you've created a pocket where an area that was originally low pressure filled in with oil created an equilibrium. It's now low pressure again. It's going to fill in again. I think the fact that there are oil wells that were dry for some time that had been tapped out, I believe Texas has several of these. I think there are a few over in the Caucasus region south of Russia. They then refill themselves when they are no longer being drained. I think what happens is that the oil is generated relatively quickly by bacterial action. And I'll say my bit on whether I'm for or against green energy, oil, whatever in a minute. They fill in relatively quickly. As long as when you siphon it back out, it becomes low pressure, it fills back in a century or so. That is, it takes a far less than the tens of thousands of years that they claim. Thus, I do not believe in peak oil, strictly speaking. I think if the world's consumption of oil were too much more substantially higher than it is now, we would eventually run out, and we would end up having to literally take like a 5 or 6 decade break before we could tap more, which would crush the world economy. It would bring about nothing short of an apocalypse. You need that oil for literally everything. A lot of people would starve, famine would break out, and then this sort of starved, impoverished population would be more disease prone. Everything would kind of fall. You'd have a lot of epidemics and a lot of warfare. That's what I think. So I don't believe in peak oil, but what I do believe in is you could still tap it out. I also think there are obviously now, we know that there's more oil as well in parts of the world we never thought there was oil in before. Oil exploration has turned up massive new quantities. There's a lot of it off Nigeria. There's gas and oil off the coast of Israel and Egypt. Venezuela's got an enormous amount. We know fracking can extract resources we couldn't get to before necessarily. However, I will say this. I still think the world should move towards green energy. I don't believe that the government should favor green energy over any other energy source. I say let the free market deal with it. I don't believe specifically in anthropic climate change. I believe that the climate has changed. It will change. We do not have a large enough set of data to determine for sure that humans are responsible for the current warming trend, which may or may not, depending on who you ask and what data you consult, even be continuing right now. It could be cooling back off. If you look at long-term temperature trends, it appears we're in a cooling trend. We are very briefly, for the last century or so, upswinging. It's now evening out. It's going to fall back down. Then it'll go up again. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Oil extraction, if we assume it's the result of archaebacteria that are not really interacting with the world above, that is, they're creating these materials by draining nutrients like radiation and other things deep within the crust. We are then bringing that carbon, which was deep within the Earth's crust in some form or another, to the surface. We are spewing it into our air. And I am not so much worried about more carbon dioxide as I am less oxygen. I think the number of humans and all the livestock and shit that we have up here is going to reduce the oxygen level. I think that's more dangerous than increasing carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide will eventually get reabsorbed by plant life. Literally, if we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, what's going to happen? Plants are going to absorb that and grow faster. I hate to sound like one of these really, really redneck Bible thumpers, but their theory is fundamentally correct if you've ever studied biology. Yes, the plants will begin, literally, what will happen is that evolution will continue because evolution is reality. It's inarguable. We know that it's real. Evolution will take place. Minute changes will mean that these plants, over time, you're going to select for. You're going to have a favoring of plants that are able to take up more CO2, grow to larger sizes, reproduce more efficiently in various ways. They will be selected for. You will literally see, over the span of perhaps thousands of years, plant species will begin to get larger. Plant species will begin to grow faster. Plant species will not suffer some of the limitations in our relatively low period of carbon dioxide levels that we've been in for some time. That means many thousands of years. You don't have megaflora in the sense that you did in ancient times any more than you have megafauna. The resources there, formed by the basis of which is formed by photosynthetic life forms, by producers, not by consumers, is far less now than it was in ancient times. We're talking the era of Pangaea and so forth. The Triassic period, the Jurassic period into the Cretaceous before the asteroid comes or whatever happened to wipe out the dinosaurs. Maybe that was climate change related. We don't know for sure. There's no peak oil, but we should still move towards green energy. I say that specifically because of several things. The extraction of oil and coal and things like that leads to resource wars. If countries are generating their energy from the sun or from wind or from something like that, there's not so much of a competition going on for that energy. Number two, it's cheaper. You could literally and number three, it's more secure. Attacking an oil rig is a great way for a bunch of crazy jihadists or something to prove a point and cause millions of dollars in damage with a single outing. But in order to destroy a decentralized grid, a decentralized power grid in which people have rooftop solar and little wind farms and so forth everywhere is a lot more difficult. It takes a lot more effort. The payoff's a lot lower. Ultimately, it's not going to be worth it. I would say nuclear power, while a good stand-in for the time being and while necessary because we've become reliant upon it, is not a great idea either. For exactly the same reasons. We're taking these radioactive materials, we're refining them, we're making them into fuel. We then store them for thousands of years. It's no good. We should leave them where they are when possible to do so. I understand it's lucrative. I understand it's fairly cheap power as well. Ultimately, though, in a free market, one in which nuclear and oil and coal are not subsidized or more heavily taxed, in which all the energy sources are competing evenly, renewable energy would eventually be the future. It's just a matter of how quickly it takes. Now, I know that the general tendency of a lot of people is to say, well, we need to spur green energy by getting government money into it. We need to subsidize green energy. We need it fast. That will actually cause the opposite to happen. I know that the tendency is to believe that those subsidies will speed up the process of switching over, but what it's actually doing is subsidizing companies using substandard equipment, substandard techniques, and substandard technology to instead spend that extra money on installing these systems rather than innovating ones that are more cost effective so that the private market can cause them to be taken up. That is, I believe in a taxpayer subsidy for home generation. By the way, I think that it would necessarily have to include like a gas generator or something. That's fine. But when the government goes in, signs a guarantee for some, like Solyndra, for a solar company or something, there's no real reason for them to attempt to innovate unless that's specifically what they're being paid to do. If you want to create a contest for all the solar companies, develop a better solar panel, develop a more efficient method, one that uses less heavy metals in manufacturing, one which lasts longer, one that's lighter and more mobile, one that can be wrapped around a car, an electric car or something to recharge it on the road. That's one thing, but when you simply throw money at them and say, yeah, here's part of your year's operating costs, there's no reason for them to innovate. They're not going to spend that kind of money. They're going to spend that on an ad campaign to get people to buy existing solar systems. Wind, it's the same thing. You'd have the same thing with oil. When we subsidize these oil companies and we give them these federal lands to explore on and so forth, it's not actually lowering the cost of oil beyond, yes, more is being extracted and we don't have complete price fixing yet. It doesn't make sense really to subsidize many of the things that get subsidized. We need green energy. It's a great idea. We should stop polluting with oil and coal and all of these other things. But the government's not going to be able to make that go any faster. A bunch of environmentalists is not going to be able to make it go any faster. And ultimately, I am not myself too concerned with the concept of oil extraction, largely because I studied biology. I know. It's funny. A lot of the activists and environmentalists and so forth that complain loud and long about oil appear not to have actually studied science, and yet they constantly talk about the denial of science, but they themselves never really studied it. They don't know much about science in many cases, or if they do, you'd have a veterinarian here, a soft-hearted person, cares about animals, doesn't want to see them, fucked up by an oil leak. Oh, that's noble. I don't have a problem with that, but you're not a biologist. You're not a petrochemical engineer. You're not a geologist or something. You're just somebody who has an emotional opinion. Unfortunately, what has happened is that we've got a lot of politicians who, for monetary reasons, because they want to give subsidies to these companies, because they got donated to by many companies associated with them or invested in them, and you can't just look at some little solar company. You have to look at who's invested in it. Who was it? Was it Rockefeller? Was it the Koch brothers? Who invested in it? Who gave them that money and then turned around and maybe gave a little bit to Obama or Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or somebody else? I'm sure you'll find some connections there. You have to look a little bit deeper than just the surface. It's one thing to say, well, family friendly, solar, wind, oh, it's great. I believe that Rockefeller divested in oil a few years ago, which is why I said at the time, you should probably drop your oil stocks and look what happened to oil. Probably a good idea. If the Rockefeller family divests in something suddenly, They know what's going on. You should follow their lead. And I believe invested heavily in solar. Well, part of that is profit motive, because they know that solar and wind are going to slowly creep up. They're going to form a larger and larger basis of the Western world's energy supply. Ideally, decentralization also takes place. Imagine a world without power lines, in which each home and business is generating its own power, where you have just like neighborhood plants, just little generators that are hooked up to all the different home systems that have a little battery in the ground to make sure there's no like major energy spike or something if a bolt of lightning hits something. That's a great idea. It would look better. It would be more efficient. It'd be a hell of a lot fucking cheaper for people. But ultimately, the government has to get out of the way for that to happen. If the government continues to impose regulations, it makes it more expensive. People argue for a solar subsidy. They don't even realize about 40% of the cost of a home solar system is regulatory. They don't even realize the government's making it more expensive than giving you a subsidy if you've got the capital to invest in it. Peak oil is a myth. I believe oil is created literally by bacteria, by an enormous population of bacteria all over the crust, slowly excreting waste products over time. They get compressed. That pressure causes it to become what we would consider purified, semi-purified, into crude oil, and that's where it comes from. That's what I believe. I could be completely and utterly wrong, but again, the liquid dinosaur theory is on its way out. We know that's not necessarily the case. Maybe it's some sort of decomposition of certain minerals within the crust. It could be that too. Maybe that has something to do with bacteria. It doesn't ultimately, though, matter, because we have a good reason to believe that oil recharges itself more quickly than we thought, or perhaps there's deeper oil moving into these pockets we're creating of lower pressure from pumping it. Either way, there's significantly more oil than people thought, under Jimmy Carter or something like that. Obviously, because otherwise we would have run out already. So yeah, there's my thoughts on peak oil and about oil in general, green energy. I fully support green energy. Green energy is great, but it needs to catch up in efficiency. It needs to be incentivized to increase its technological sufficiency, its efficiency, as opposed to, well, we'll make it a little bit cheaper after imposing a massive regulatory fee for people to install systems that already exist. They're not efficient enough. You can't have a 0% growth in efficiency forever and expect people to take the product seriously. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, because it's taxpayer money to begin with. That's about all. Peace out.